So, good evening, everyone. This is John Steinbach with the Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee, and the co host is Ellen Thomas with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And WILF and the Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee are co sponsoring this teach in on the 80th anniversary of the birth of the nuclear age, the Trinity Test in Alamogordo. And so today we're going to be focusing on the current nuclear crisis. I would argue unprecedented nuclear crisis that the world is facing today. But we're going to be looking at that crisis through the eyes and through the testimony of the victims of the bomb. And so we have with us today, we're going to start out with Tina Cordova, and she's the director of the Tularosa Downwinders Consortium. These are the victims of the Trinity explosion, the tens of thousands that were directly downwind. We have Mary Yakaitis, who is with the Utah Downwinders, representing the broader downwinder community. We are going to be joined by Dr. Arjun Makhijani, the director of the Institute for Environmental and Energy Research. And Arjun is one of the foremost experts on the health effects of the bombing and of the Trinity bombing itself. We'll be hearing directly from Professor Peter Kuznick with the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. And Peter and I have been working together, I think, well over 30 years. So we're going to be hearing his historical analysis. And then we're going to also have, we're going to end the program with a video of Hideko Tamura, who is a survivor of Hiroshima, and she was going to be on the panel, but she wasn't feeling well. So Ellen has prepared a testimony that we'll tack on at the end of the program so that people, as we leave today, we can listen to her words, her testimony, and reflect on the horrors of the bomb. So introducing Tina. So Tina has works very closely with the descendants, and she is actually a descendant herself. And so she's been very busy. They've already had 2 or 3 programs last week, and they've had a variety of programs today, and she has to leave very quickly. So she's going to talk with us for about 10 minutes about what they're doing out there at the Trinity site, and to talk a little bit about her family's and her community's experience with the bomb. So Tina, can you talk with us?
Absolutely, John. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with you all tonight on the evening of July 16th, 2025, which happens to be the 80th anniversary of the Trinity bomb. I want to share a little bit about the bomb itself for those people who are not aware of exactly why the bomb was so detrimental to our health. First of all, there were things our government knew, and there were things our government didn't know. The things that they knew in advance were, number one, that radiation was dangerous to human health. That was a well-established fact in 1945. The second thing that they absolutely knew is that the bomb was going to spread radiation all over the state of New Mexico. And how and why did they know that? Because they did a precursor test called the 100-ton test in May of 1945 out on the Alamogordo bombing range. And what they did was they took 100 tons of conventional explosive devices, they laced it with radiation, and then they tracked the radiation. And indeed, they spread radiation all over the Tularosa Basin. So they were well aware of what was going to happen. What they didn't know, though, is exactly how much plutonium would be necessary for the fission process. So they overpacked the bomb with plutonium. They put 13 pounds of weapons-grade plutonium in the bomb when only 3 pounds were necessary, which means a full 10 pounds of weapons-grade plutonium went up in the fireball that they estimate traveled over 7 miles past the atmosphere into the stratosphere. The reason that the bomb exploded in that way is because it was the only time a bomb was ever placed on a platform so close to the ground, 100 feet off the ground. In comparison, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those bombs were detonated at 1,600 and 1,800 feet respectively. And it is what they learned at Trinity that educated them on what to do in Japan. So our bomb did not create destruction. The bomb here in New Mexico was not a destructive bomb. It created mass fallout. So that radioactive ash fell for days and it coated everything. We lived very organic lifestyles. We didn't have running water. We depended on the rain that fell from the sky, and we collected it in cisterns. We had holding ponds in town where people could access water. We had ditches, we had rivers, lakes, streams, and all of that was now contaminated as the ash fell from the sky, including everybody's cisterns. We also didn't have available to us electricity at people's homes. Electricity was not available to everybody like it is today. So we didn't have refrigeration, which means we didn't have grocery stores. We had mercantile stores, and what you could buy in a mercantile were things like sugar, flour, coffee, rice, cereal, but you couldn't buy dairy, you couldn't buy meat, and you couldn't buy produce. We spent a great deal of our time in 1945 attending to our need for food, which meant everybody had a garden and everybody had an orchard. And we had 3 active dairies in the little town that I grew up in, Tularosa. And so people drank fresh cow's milk and ate fresh produce, and we raised cows and chickens and pigs and goats and sheep, and we produced everything that we ate at our own homes. And that made it very dangerous for us. The last thing is, we also didn't have access to a tap where we got water. So because of that, we didn't bathe as often. And it's very likely that on the day of the blast and in those days afterwards, as the ash fell from the sky, if it got on people's scalp or on their skin, it stayed there for days until they had an opportunity to bathe. There's 3 ways that you're exposed to radiation, and likely all of you understand that: inhalation, ingestion, and absorption. We, because of our lifestyle, were maximally exposed to radioactive fallout from the Trinity bomb. They didn't warn us before or afterwards. And the truth of the matter is that the meteorologists and the physicians assigned to the test actually finally convinced General Groves that he should prepare to evacuate some people. And so there was a town fairly close by, 35 miles away, the crows fly. And instead of, because we already had an active rail system, we had a railroad that ran through all of the small towns around New Mexico. Instead of lining up some rail cars where people might be evacuated, they lined up some cattle trucks. And I just want everybody to understand that we don't move cattle in New Mexico in July because it's inhumane. These trucks would have been filthy, they wouldn't have had proper ventilation, and they wouldn't have had a place for people to be seated. When I think about that, it's very disturbing for me. My good friend Bernice Gutierrez, who's on our steering committee, was born 8 days before the bomb in that town of Carrizozo. I always picture her mom wrapping her up in a blanket and being herded into a cattle truck where there's not proper ventilation, no place for them to sit down, where it's filthy, and then taken away on dirt roads, because our roads were dirt roads back then. And when the army soldiers that were in Carrizozo with the rudimentary Geiger counters, when those Geiger counters reached the threshold that they had set for evacuation and they radioed back to base camp, they told them, wait a little longer, and it doubled. And then they waited longer than that and it doubled again. And eventually they told them, it's not safe to be there, you need to leave. But they didn't warn us. They never said anything to us. And they allowed us to continue to live in a very contaminated environment. So what that has meant is that essentially we've been dying ever since. To give you an example, in my own family, I'm the 4th generation to have cancer since 1945. I had 2 great-grandfathers living in Tularosa at the time. They both died in 1955 from what they were told was stomach cancer. We'll never know. There was no diagnostic process, no treatment available. They were given morphine, sent home to die, and they died in short order. Both my grandmothers had cancer. My father was a 4-year-old child living that very organic lifestyle that I described, dipping water out of the cistern and drinking mass quantities of fresh cow's milk. My father developed 2 primary oral tumors spaced 8 years apart. And in between those 2 primary oral tumors, he got prostate cancer. I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer at the age of 39, and I have heretofore been healthy. Went through having my thyroid removed, have lived most of my life without a thyroid, and went through the radioactive iodine treatments afterwards. And I'm a lucky one. I have a niece. She's now the 5th generation. She's 24 years old, and a year ago at the age of 23, she was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. She's had lots of complications, and her treatment continues today. If that weren't enough, I have 2 brothers. My youngest brother, her father was diagnosed with kidney cancer in January of this year. We buried one of our cousins in December, and then my brother was diagnosed. And it actually is exactly what I describe all the time. Someone dies and we bury them, and someone else is diagnosed. And my family is not unique. We've documented thousands of families just like mine displaying 5 generations of cancer now. The other thing I want to say is I think most people think that when they detonate a bomb like this, that it's somewhat of a static process. The bomb is detonated, it disperses radioactive material. If you were alive at the time you were exposed. The truth is that radioactive material in some cases has exceedingly long half-lives. Plutonium half-life, 24,000 years. Strontium and cesium half-life, around 35 years. So because we were exposed at Trinity and are probably still being exposed to radioactive isotopes resultant of Trinity, we were also exposed to the 93 detonations that took place at the Nevada test site. This is the legacy, folks. This is the legacy that's been left for us to deal with. And until just recently, July 3rd, we have been left unacknowledged for 80 years. Congress finally passed a bill that will extend some very modest compensation to the downwinders of New Mexico for the first time ever. It's a great first step, but we're not there yet. We'll take this victory. We'll walk through this open door, and we'll continue to go to Congress and ask them for more. We need healthcare coverage, which they stripped out of the bill, saying it was going to cost too much. This, as we spend trillions of dollars to modernize our nuclear weapons. They also only gave us a 2-year extension, which in the case of New Mexico will not be adequate time for us to get everybody enrolled in the program that should be enrolled in the program, that deserves to be enrolled in the program. And so, you know, this is the work that we've been doing for 20 years now. This is the advocacy work that we've been doing for 20 years. Our goal was always to educate people about what happened to us, to educate people about how our bodies bear the legacy of Trinity and how this isn't going to end for us. And today, in our communities here, we celebrate the fact that we've finally seen at least a minor victory. And we have today also had our state, for the first time ever, recognize us by placing a permanent sign at the Stallion Gate entrance to the Trinity site that mentions that there is a human cost to the development and testing of nuclear devices, and that the people in New Mexico were the human cost of the Trinity bomb. On that sign, on one side, it has a quote from my friend Henry Herrera, who has long since passed away. And it says something to the effect of, "We were outside, we experienced the blast. It knocked me off my feet. I thought the world was ending. I was 11 years old, you know." Henry was 11 years old that day, and he was outside with his dad putting water into the radiator of his dad's truck because we didn't have antifreeze back then, and they would have to put water during the hot season every day. And Henry experienced the blast, and he lived to go through having cancer of the parotid gland and then the jaw, and he suffered a great deal before he passed away a couple years ago. And so this is the legacy we deal with. Today, though, we celebrate the placement of that sign that will forever memorialize our loss. And tonight, we have Mass with Archbishop Wester, who has become one of the biggest anti-nuclear activists in the country. His sermons that he delivers in Catholic churches everywhere are about how possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. We can only hope that his message continues to touch people's hearts and their minds so that we can all be on the same page when it comes to this. He'll deliver Mass for us tonight. We'll have dinner afterwards, and then we'll go to our 16th annual candlelight vigil. We're in my little town, my little village of Tularosa, a village with a population of about 3,500 people. We will light over 1,000 candles, part of what's called illuminatia, a brown paper bag with sand in it and a votive candle and the name of somebody on it that has passed away. We call out every one of those names. It takes us quite a bit of time. And the reason we do it is because long ago when we conceived of this, we decided that if no one's ever going to come back, if no one's ever going to acknowledge our loved ones, at least once a year, we will acknowledge them, we will say their names out loud, and we will not let them be forgotten. I want to thank all of you who have followed our work and supported our work and spoken to others about our work. And with that, I'll end tonight because I've got to make my way over to the church in Tularosa. I appreciate all of you. I hope that you have a great meeting. This photo that you're seeing is what we call the 150-mile radius map. So this young student at UNM years ago asked if he could do something to help us. And I said, yes, we need to challenge the narrative that the government established that no one lived here, no one was harmed, that it was remote and uninhabited. And so he took 1940 census data, identified each census tract, meticulously identified each census tract, and wrote out the number of people that lived there. And now because of that, we know that in a 20-mile radius, there were 13,000 children, women, and men living adjacent to the Trinity site. And in a 50-mile radius, that number grows. At 150 miles, it's all the way up to 500,000 people. It was not remote and uninhabited. They didn't see us, and they didn't want to see us. They didn't see us, and that was purposeful. And so thank you, Arjun, and I appreciate all of you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you, and we'll keep in touch and keep you all informed of what is ahead of us.
Thank you, Tina. I want to highly recommend an op-ed in yesterday's Washington Post. It was written by Eric Singer, who did the youth version of the Oppenheimer book, and it's titled "We Caught It on Our Tongues," and it's about 12 girls that were in summer camp directly downwind from the Trinity explosion, and they thought that it was snowing, and they ran out the next day and they tasted it and they rubbed the fallout in their skin, and they went swimming in the polluted pool, and there were 12 girls and only 2 of them survived past the age of 40. So I think that's a really good example of what Tina is talking about. And again, Tina, thank you so much, and give our love to everyone there.
I take you all with me in my heart to our candlelight vigil. Thank you so much.
So next I'm going to introduce my friend Peter Kuznick. Professor Kuznick is the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He's written extensively about these issues, but to introduce him, I want to throw out a word, Peter. And the word is called Wei Ji, and that's a Chinese word, and it means crisis, and it means opportunity. So I'm guessing it's probably either Confucian origin or maybe a Taoist origin. And my guess is that originally the idea of crisis and opportunity actually aren't different words, but they're the same words. And considering that I introduced the program saying we are in a time of unprecedented crisis, I guess that means this is a time of unprecedented opportunity. So, Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you, John. John just mentioned the op-ed in yesterday's Washington Post by Eric Singer. Well, Eric, for those of you who don't know, was my undergraduate advisee, and I chaired his PhD committee. Eric was also the director of research for Oliver Stone and me on our Untold History of the United States project, and he just did the Young Readers edition of the Oppenheimer book that the movie was based on. So everybody should be following Eric's work. John mentioned before that he and I have been working together on nuclear issues for more than 30 years. Well, I have to give John credit because he was the one who introduced me to Nihon Nidankyo for the first time and to Rumi Tanaka. And I've been working closely with Nihon Nidankyo since then, and I've been nominating them for the Nobel Peace Prize. And this year, as most of you know, Nihon Nidankyo won the Nobel Peace Prize. So I had the great opportunity. They invited me to be part of their delegation in Oslo, which was very special also. But tonight I want to start on a different note. 3 days before Israel began bombing Iran, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard released a 3.5-minute video warning about the threat of nuclear annihilation. She began from Hiroshima, and she said, "I recently visited Hiroshima and stood at the epicenter of a city scarred by the unimaginable horror caused by a single nuclear bomb dropped in 1945. What I saw, the stories I heard, and the haunting sadness that remains will stay with me forever. But those were small bombs. Today's are multiple times more powerful." She then warned of a nuclear holocaust, and she chastised the warmongers for bringing the world, she said, closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation than ever before. Tulsi was having one of her increasingly rare moments of lucidity and sanity when she wasn't obscenely and humiliatingly groveling before Donald Trump. She used to be much better on these issues, but her message was clear, and it couldn't have been more timely. And I wrote to her to thank her for this. But I want to start by putting this dealing with some of the current context, because on August 20th, 2024, almost a year ago, there were two very crucial articles written. One was by New York Times security expert David Sanger, and the second was by Jack O'Doherty in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And Sanger's was called Biden Approved Secret Nuclear Strategy Refocusing on Chinese Threat. And he went through the fact that U.S. strategy now, based on all the people he was interviewing, was that we had to be ready to simultaneously fight a three-front nuclear war against Russia and China and South Korea. She said, well, he didn't get into this so much, but clearly U.S. thinking is influenced by some of what's going on between the U.S. and Ukraine and Russia and Putin's nuclear threats, and Biden's giving Ukraine permission to use ATACMS missiles to strike deep inside of Russia. And now we see Trump's recent developments on that. So that was one. And Sanger said, if that wasn't sufficiently alarming, then the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that very same day had a piece by O'Doherty that said that the U.S. was not only planning to fight a three-front nuclear war, but that the U.S. thought there are many people in the U.S. who thought we could win a nuclear war. They said there are two camps now. One are the deterrence theorists who think that if we build up our second attack, our retaliatory capabilities, And they believed that since nobody could win a nuclear war, nobody would start one. They said that there's a second group now that's emerging who believes not only can we win a nuclear war, now can fight a nuclear war, we can win it. And the bulletin said that technological developments in hypersonics, anti-submarine warfare, missile defense, and AI-enabled data processing have changed the thinking about nuclear weapons. So this Strangelove scenario is back on the table. And it went on to identify these two schools of thought. And with these developments, they believe that the most stable and crucial part of the nuclear triad has always been submarines, because they were hard to detect, and so they could always be relied upon, even if the planes and the ICBMs were knocked out. However, they're saying now with the sonar technology and other technological developments, the oceans have become transparent. And American planners believe that we can take out Russian submarines before they could launch their nuclear weapons. So there's a faction. It goes back to Lieber and Press, who had an article in the Council on Foreign Relations publication, Foreign Affairs, in 2006, saying we now have the capability to launch and win a two-front nuclear war, they said then, against Russia and China, without them being able to strike the United States. The Washington Post reported that heads in the Kremlin were exploding when that article came out because they were interpreting that as official U.S. policy. So that was August 20th, 2024. But these fantasies about winning a nuclear war seem to be proliferating. On November 20th of last year, Admiral Thomas Buchanan gave a talk to the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, in which he says that the increased cooperation between Russia, China, and North Korea now means that there's a growing threat for a simultaneous attack by all three. And he says that with the real and increased cooperation between the three, there's a growing threat of simultaneous crises with the potential that our adversaries are coordinating their actions, and we can no longer compartmentalize the threats individually, but we must be prepared to deter and confront them across the spectrum of conflict. After the speech, the moderator asked him how he conceptualized winning a war with nuclear weapons. And Buchanan said, I think everybody would agree if we have to have an exchange, we want to do it on our terms that are most acceptable to the United States. So it's terms that are most acceptable to us that puts us in a position to continue to lead the world, right? Says there will be a point where we would maintain we'd have sufficient capability. We'd have to reserve capacity. You wouldn't expend all your resources to win, right? Because then you'd have nothing to deter from that point on. So what he said is we can win a nuclear war and still reserve enough nuclear capacity to subdue any foes who might threaten post-war U.S. hegemony. And you put that together with General Minihan's warning from 2023, which he said he thinks that we're going to be at war with China in 2025. And then the Financial Times reporting yesterday that Trump spoke to Zelensky about striking Moscow. And the Financial Times said he was encouraging Ukraine to hit Moscow. And they discussed sending Tomahawk cruise missiles over. Others have said that he didn't give them authorization. However, this is the level of madness that we're confronting. But our intention today is to talk about where the madness started 80 years ago today with the dawn of the nuclear age. So what I want to do is put Trinity Test in some historical context, because the bomb project began when German physicist Hannes Strassmann split the uranium atom in late 1938. Quickly, when word came to the United States, U.S. physicists began drawing up formulas not only for nuclear energy, but for developing nuclear weapons. But the military was not interested initially. The ones who were most concerned were the émigré scientists who had escaped from Nazi-occupied Europe, came to the United States, and they wanted to alert U.S. authorities to the danger of Nazi Germany developing an atomic bomb. So their initial motivation was to use the bomb as a deterrent, not as a weapon against a helpless country or against citizens in New Mexico and Texas and Arizona. So they couldn't get the Americans' interest. So two Hungarian emigres, Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner, borrowed a car and drove out to Peconic, Long Island on July 16th, 1939, 86 years ago today. And they wanted to solicit the help of Albert Einstein, the world's most famous physicist. And Einstein had been working on the unified field theory, so he was so out of the loop that he didn't even know that the Germans had split the uranium atom 8 months earlier. But when Szilard and Wigner laid it out to him, he immediately understood it, and he signed the letter to President Roosevelt urging the United States to begin the bomb project. So when Alexander Sachs, a New York economist, delivered the letter from Einstein, Roosevelt understood it, and that started the Uranium Committee. But the Uranium Committee still moved very slowly. It was in the control of 65-year-old soil physicist Lyman Briggs. And one of the members of the committee said trying to deal with Briggs was like walking through molasses. So the United States got off to a very late start. And in 1941, the U.S. was ready to abandon nuclear research because they thought it was impossible to develop a bomb. What they thought was that we would need 500 tons of pure uranium in order to develop a bomb. But they got a report in the summer of 1941 from the British Maud Committee that said you don't need 500 tons of pure uranium, 11 to 22 pounds of uranium would suffice. So at that point, they proceeded with the project and began the Manhattan Project. Initially, it was at the University of Chicago under Arthur Holly Compton. And Compton asked Oppenheimer, who was teaching at Caltech in Berkeley, to take a group of leading theoreticians out to Berkeley in the summer of 1942 to think about the implications of the bomb project. Among them was Edward Teller. And Teller, from the very beginning, didn't even want to deal with the atomic bomb. He says, that's a trivial issue. What we need to do is go right for the super bomb. He said, because that can be made any size up to the sun. Oppenheimer had to quiet him down to get him to focus on the atomic bomb, which, as we know, is simply a trigger for the hydrogen bomb. Then they began doing the calculations. And at one point, all the physicists in the room froze at fear because the equation up on the board showed them that igniting an atomic bomb could possibly ignite all the hydrogen in the oceans or all the nitrogen in the atmosphere. So Oppenheimer had stopped this right now. He got on the train, went out to Michigan to see Arthur Holly Compton. And after explaining to Compton, Compton said, stop this immediately. Better to accept the slavery of the Nazis than to run a chance of drawing down the final curtain on mankind. They went back to Berkeley, and Hans Bethe, the best mathematician in the group, redid the calculations and saw that they hadn't accounted for all the heat that would be absorbed by radiation, and they figured that the chances of blowing up the universe were 3 in a million. And they said, okay, that's good enough odds. Let's go ahead with the bomb project. The British concluded in late 43, that Germany was not developing a bomb, and they informed the Americans. Oppenheimer apparently knew this in late 1943, but he did not tell the other scientists, and they kept on accelerating the pace, especially after Germany was defeated. So they worked feverishly to develop a bomb. When they learned in late 44 that the Germans were not developing a bomb, only one physicist left the Manhattan Project. That was Joseph Rotblat, who was a great man who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995. But the story, I'm going to make it quick, In February of 1945 at Yalta, Stalin promised Roosevelt that the Soviets would enter the Pacific War 3 months after the end of war in Europe. So the war in Europe ends around May 8th or 9th, which means that the Soviets would be coming into the war August 8th or 9th. U.S. intelligence was reporting that Russian entry into the war will convince the Japanese that further resistance is futile, and that the Japanese would surrender as soon as the Soviets entered the war. The other way to get the Soviets to get the Japanese to surrender without use of the bomb was to change the demand for unconditional surrender. So we knew this, that we could end the war without without use of the bomb. Then we get the bomb test on July 16th. That was the test of the plutonium bomb. We had two types of bombs. The uranium bomb, we used the shotgun method to detonate that, and everybody was 100% convinced that would work. But they wanted to test the plutonium bomb. And the scientists placed bets on the size of the explosion, 100 scientists, and the one who came the closest was I. Rabi. And he said it would be 18 kilotons, and that was about what it was. They also placed bets on whether they would blow up the universe. And the scientists' response to the Trinity Test, some of them thought they had done so. They thought it was out of control. The heat, the light, the blast, the sound was so enormous that they were terrified by it. Fortunately, it didn't blow up the universe, but now we're still working at it again. So they ignored the radiation risks, as Tina was saying, and I could go into detail on that, but I'll use my time for other things. So that was July 16th, 1945. The next day, Stalin and Truman had lunch together at Potsdam, and Stalin assured Truman that the Soviets were coming into the war on schedule. Truman goes home and writes in his diary, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs. He writes home to his wife Bess the next day. The Russians are coming in. We'll end the war a year sooner now. Think of all the kids who won't be killed. When Truman gets a full report on how powerful the explosion was at Trinity, he writes in his diary, "It has discovered the most terrible bomb in history. This may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. Not a bigger, more powerful bomb. This was at least the third or fourth time that Truman has understood that he was building a bomb capable of ending all life on the planet. Yet he goes ahead and uses it in the most reckless way, the way he'd been warned by Stimson and Groves on April 25th could lead to this unending arms race that could end in disaster." So the point that I'm trying to make is that the bombs were not in any way necessary for ending the war. The Americans knew that. Truman knew it. Truman referred to the intercepted telegram on July 18th as the telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. Most Americans don't know that the United States had 8 five-star admirals and generals in 1945. 7 of the 8 were on the record as saying the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both, including Admiral Leahy, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Eisenhower, General MacArthur. We can go down the list. They all knew that. The U.S. Navy Museum today, here in Washington, D.C., has an exhibit that says that in the Japanese cabinet, there was almost no discussion of the atomic bombs. What they all focused on was the Soviet invasion. And the madness escalates from there. By 1985, the world had 70,000 nuclear bombs. I used to find myself, when I would take my students every year for more than 25 years to Hiroshima and Nagasaki every August, I used to find myself writing down the same data from one of the exhibits that by 1985, the world had accumulated the equivalent of 1.47 million Hiroshima bombs. We finally got that down to now under 14,000. However, the number is increasing again. Almost every nuclear power is modernizing, and almost every one of them is planning to increase again. When Trump, during his first term, was told that we had cut the size of our nuclear arsenal, he said we should increase it tenfold. It led Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to call him a fucking moron. And he's right. And he's just as dangerous now. Uh, we go back to the Oppenheimer movie. There's a lot to criticize in the Oppenheimer movie, but there's also a lot to appreciate. And I love the ending of the movie. Even though it was entirely apocryphal, it was nonetheless perfect. In that scene, you might remember, Strauss, Oppenheimer's enemy, always blamed Oppenheimer, not only for humiliating him publicly, but for turning Einstein against him. And in the movie before that, we had twice seen Oppenheimer walk up to Einstein near the lake and talk to him, after which Einstein walked right past Strauss without looking at him or saying a word. So Strauss assumed they were talking shit about him. But neither he nor the audience has any idea what was said between them before Einstein walks away. But the last scene at the end of the movie, they show what happens. And Oppenheimer says, Albert, when I came to you with those calculations, we were worried that we'd start a chain reaction that would destroy the entire world. And Einstein says, I remember it well. What of it? And Oppenheimer says, I believe we did. The tragedy, is that Christopher Nolan may indeed have been right. And so, which is why I started with Tulsi Gabbard's warning, because we are closer to nuclear annihilation today than we've ever been. And there are warmongers out there who are planning for nuclear war. And there's a growing faction of madmen and madwomen who believe not only that a nuclear war can be fought, but that it can be won. And we've got to stop them before they take us past the point of no return.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Peter. That was very edifying. I'd just like to comment that you talked about how there was virtually no discussion about the atomic bombings. There's a book called Japan's Longest Day by the Pacific War Research Society. They also wrote one called The Day Man Lost, which is about the Hiroshima bombing and about the various nuclear projects, including the German one and the Japanese atomic bomb project. But in that history, they argue that the people in the cabinet that were discussing the terms of surrender actually had no idea of what had happened in Hiroshima. As far as they were concerned, it was another big bomb because every major city was destroyed. So they go even further than the Navy Museum in saying that it played no role in the decision to surrender. It was all about the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. So,
John, as you're saying, the United States had firebombed 100 Japanese cities before that. And the Japanese accepted that the United States could wipe out their cities. The destruction reached 98.5% in the city of Toyama. So to the Japanese leaders, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were two more cities that the Americans were wiping out, which they were willing to accept. It was the Soviet invasion that changed their thinking.
All right, thank you, Peter. So that was very good. If you can hang on, we'll have some questions and answers at the end. We heard discussion about RECA, the Radiation Effects Compensation Act, and the only reason why we got what we got, which is, really pathetically little, is due to the ceaseless work of, Tina's forebears, and then other radiation victims, people like Janet Gordon, people like Dennis and Denise Nelson, people like Mary Dixon. They're the ones that did the heavy lifting over the years, agitating and educating and organizing their neighbors. And they're the ones that deserve the credit. So next we're going to hear from Mary Yakaitis. And she's one of the downwinders who is, a friend of Janet Gordon's and a friend of Mary's and a friend of Dennis and Denise's. And she is going to be speaking about the downwinder experience. So we're going to get a slightly different perspective, but it's essentially the same story that we heard from Tina, and the same story that we're going to hear at the end of the program from the lips of a Hiroshima survivor. So, Mary, if you could talk a little bit about your story.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I'd be happy to. Like Tina, I am a downwinder and part of a national movement that's advocating for compensation of victims. And as Tina told you, we just recently had quite a victory in bringing at least some modest compensation to many people. I'm going to speak to you as one of the original generation that was exposed to atomic radiation, nuclear radiation. I speak as a representative of the downwinders, and our whole focus has been so far on advocating for compensation. But now, as the government has, or the Congress has finally recognized our need, we're probably going to be shifting to some other focuses. But I think the stories that I can tell and that you've heard from Tina certainly demonstrate the fact that we have to continue this work. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk tonight, speaking for the many people that, starting with the Trinity explosion 80 years ago and continuing, whose fates were sealed by actions of our government. To begin, I'd like to just make this a somewhat personalized discussion. And I'd ask you to join me in imagining a scene from 1951, 6 years after the Trinity explosion. We're in a side yard of my family's comfortable home in Salt Lake City. Our house is at the base of a spectacular mountain peak. We have, our next door neighbors has a peach and apricot orchard. And in this idyllic scene, a group of us are sitting under an ancient apple tree filled with ripening fruit. I and the three of my siblings play on the lawn while my parents visit with their friends. We were blissfully unaware that we were threatened by our surroundings with toxic radioactive fallout that would cost us our health, and for three of us, lead to tragic early deaths. We lived in Salt Lake City because my father was a U.S. Public Health Service officer assigned to study the health of uranium miners in Utah and Arizona. On this and many afternoons enjoying a beautiful summer, we were unaware that a few months earlier, a 1 megaton nuclear bomb was dropped from an airplane and exploded above ground in nearby Nevada. The resulting mushroom cloud showered Utah and other nearby states with toxic radioactive gases and particulates. The amount of radiation that Utah received for decades was higher in some parts of the state than in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where people were deported and not allowed to return. By the summer of 1951, when the scenario we just imagined took place, we had already inhaled toxic radioactive material into our lungs and other organs. Fallout also coated the grass eaten by cattle that provided our milk and meat, and invaded the fruit and vegetables we ate, much as Tina described to you. As vulnerable young children, we were already casualties of government actions when our leaders knew very well that downwinders and others would experience significant harm from the effects of the bomb tests in Nevada. The above ground test conducted during several years when we lived in Utah condemned all 5 of us Doyle children and my father to traumatic illnesses that would mar our lives. To personalize the tragedies our family faced a little bit, I'd like you to know a bit more about each of their lives. First, my father's story. Henry Doyle was a pipe-smoking, quiet, and well-known scientist who spent his career advocating for improved worker safety and health. Dad brought our young growing family to live in Arizona about the same time the Trinity explosion spewed radiation over that state. A few years later, we moved to Salt Lake City, accompanying my dad on his assignment with the U.S. Public Health Service. His task was to study the effects of uranium exposures on the Navajo miners in southern Utah and northern Arizona. This assignment included 6 months in Japan, learning more about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki explosion health effects. Years later, after retiring from the PHS, Public Health Service, with an outstanding record, he worked with Congress, providing evidence in hearings that eventually led to the passage of RECA. Dad died early in the 70s of lung disease related to his radiation exposures. Mercifully, he passed too early to see the concerns he had about harm from radioactive fallout to strike his own family. Marcia, my youngest sister, was the first of our siblings to suffer the effects of life in Utah. Her illness began in her early 50s, typical of the delayed onset experienced by most people exposed to fallout during these tests. She was a mother of 5, a community and school activist, and a co-founder of a highly successful Maryland business. I remember her as a younger sister, a companion for mountain hikes, disobeying my parents. They worried about dangerous wildlife, but were not aware at that time that the real danger was toxic radioactive fallout in our surroundings. We also spent afternoons sitting in our fruit trees eating sweet purple plums and apricots dusted with fallout. Marcia died at 52 of ovarian cancer, leaving a 12-year-old to grow up without a mother and 4 other children whom she never knew as adults. Cherry, another sister, was a toddler in Salt Lake City. She became the family glamour girl, a tall, blonde, strikingly beautiful woman with an infectious joy and sparkling humor. Cherry grew up to serve as the director of production for the immensely popular Smithsonian Magazine. In her mid-50s, radioactive fallout cost her a breast, and a few years later, her life. Henry Jr., who we called Hank, was a baby when we lived in Utah. He grew up to be an engineer who played important roles in construction of 2 Washington landmarks, the African American Museum and the World Bank headquarters. At 77, he is a survivor of prostate cancer, one of 2 in our family lucky enough to live past middle age. Charles, called Chuck, was conceived in Utah and exposed in utero to radioactive fallout. He became a devoted naturalist and a lover of all animal and family life. His quiet temperament and sly humor enchanted everyone he met. Chuck distinguished himself serving in Vietnam. He was born without permanent teeth, a probable effect of radiation exposure. Chuck developed liver cancer in his mid-50s and did not live to celebrate his 60th birthday. Our family life in Arizona and Utah has taken a toll on my life as well. As I look forward to my 87th birthday, I'm grateful to have enjoyed a long life, but the price I've paid for our life in Utah is high. It includes 6 conditions recognized as linked to radiation exposures, including breast cancer, precancerous tumors of the thyroid and small intestine, lung disease, and infertility. Significantly, none of my many physicians who've treated me understood that my problems could be linked to radiation exposures. Harm to my family did not end with me, my family, or my siblings. Among our next generation are birth defects, including a missing limb in one child and another born without permanent teeth, all likely effects of our life in Utah. We are grateful that a few weeks ago, RECA was expanded and reauthorized for 6 months after Congress allowed it to expire for 6 months. The new RECA provides $100,000 compensations for some victims and medical exposures for loss, and compensation to include medical expenses and loss of life. But money won't address the scope of our personal tragedies. And many people exposed to radiation remain ineligible for compensation under RECA. Downwinders plead for action by government to address the actual scope of the problem. All of those who've fallen ill and their heirs need compensation under RECA. We also need a massive public awareness campaign to alert those who do not realize that they or their families are at risk. Protocols for monitoring and early medical intervention can help save lives. Also essential are binding assurances that the nations of the world will forever outlaw nuclear weapons development, testing, and use in warfare. Our sacrifices make it essential to remember the lessons learned from the Trinity explosion and other weapons testing that lasted into the 1960s. We must take action to prevent continuing risks to the lives and well-being of people everywhere. In closing, I want to acknowledge the important efforts of our sponsoring organizations. The dedicated people in these groups play important roles in helping save mankind from nuclear Armageddon. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary, and hopefully you can stay on. We'll be opening the program to questions and comments following Arjun's talk. So I want to introduce Arjun next. Arjun and I have been friends significantly longer than Peter and I. Our friendship goes back to 1981, I would say, and he was a founding member of the Hiroshima Peace Committee. He's written a number of books. Nuclear Wastelands. He was the chief author. That's one of the books. As I'm donating my libraries to various organizations, that's one book that I'm going to keep with me. And Peter, I'm keeping your book with me too. So I have some bedside reading when I get old. But yeah, by the way, Arjun, my favorite book that you wrote was the one you wrote about capitalism. So that maybe with John Kelly, that was a pretty small.
I wrote that. Yeah.
So let me introduce you correctly though. So Arjun and I talk on the phone, fairly frequently, and we sort of see things through the same eyes. And so we talk about the crisis, and we talk about how there's no meaningful arms control agreements anymore, and it's increasingly unlikely that we're going to be able to save the New START. We all know that the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is in tatters. It's been in tatters the last 15 to 20 years. The nations of the world are very unhappy with the NPT. The IAEA has been discredited with because of malfeasance at high levels, and also we're looking at the age of limits. So Michael Clare wrote the book Resource Wars, several books along those lines, that as resources are depleted and as the population grows, it's going to bring tension. So we have that tension. We have the reality of climate change. As we speak, the temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, our surface temperatures are over 90 degrees, over 86 degrees in the Mediterranean Sea. So we have that limit. We also have the reality, and Arjun and I have talked about this, the reality that we're seeing, in real time, the end of 500 years of colonialism and neocolonialism and Western imperialism, that the majority of the world's people, and I got that phrase from Arjun, the world's majority, are saying, no, we're not going to let us, we're not going to be dictated to, we're not going to let you enslave us, we're not going to let you plunder our resources. So all of that is coming together at the same time, and I see it as the age of limits. And that makes the whole situation even more dangerous. So I wanted to give you that introduction, Arjun, because this is, in my estimation, the most critical time in world history, but it also gives us an opportunity at this time to respond in a way that will work for the benefit of the children. So having said that, that's my introduction to you. So Arjun, your reflections.
Thank you, John. I wasn't planning to go there, but since you mentioned climate and all these other catastrophes human beings have brought upon the earth, I began writing an essay sometime back, which I haven't finished yet, on the problem of sustainability. While I haven't finished the essay, I do have a title for what we've been doing for at least 500 years, and in some ways longer than that. It's extraction extinction. We have met the asteroid, and it is us. So you know where I stand on, the outcome of human activities. I'm going to confine myself to Hiroshima. How did we get here? I'll pick up, Peter has already mentioned some of the things, so pardon me if I repeat some of them. But I'm going to weave a slightly different story. So you know about the Einstein letter. He signed the letter that Szilard had drafted. And Roosevelt set up the Uranium Committee. Now, Einstein's goal and that of the emigre scientists, as you know, was to prevent German nuclear monopoly, that Germany and Hitler should not be able to blackmail the world. And that was his goal. But it was not the only goal. That was not the only idea that scientists had. In fact, one scientist had quite a different idea. He understood the idea that Nazis should not be able to blackmail the United States into surrender, but he had a larger ambition that was very much in accord with the ambition of the foreign policy establishment. Foreign Affairs, the very establishment foreign policy journal, wrote in 1944 that basically we're the arsenal of the world, the arsenal of democracy, and this arsenal will bring us to victory, and we should put it to use to control the world after. They didn't know about the Manhattan Project, presumably the ones who wrote that, but it gives you an idea of what the establishment thinking was about the US post-war role. The person I'm thinking about, who's not as well known as Einstein, but I think he should be, was a fellow named Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush was an electrical engineer, brilliant inventor, vice president of MIT, and he was president of the Carnegie Institution in Washington in 1939. And when he came to Washington, he was very, very ambitious. His thinking, war was looming. The United States was not in the war. The US sentiment publicly was very much on the isolationist side. FDR, ran very gingerly around all that in 1940 about whether the US would enter the war or not. But here's what Vannevar Bush thought at that time. The world is probably going to be ruled by those who know how, in the fullest sense, to apply science. Now, he wanted to be the guy that developed the weapons that would be advanced apply science to the fullest, and he wanted to bring academic science, academic scientists who were sort of regarded more or less derisively as eggheads who couldn't accomplish anything for the current war by the Pentagon. He thought they could do better and that he could organize that. He proposed to organize the science for new weapons. One of his ideas was, instance, to put radar devices on bombs. So essentially create the first smart bombs. They were called proximity switches. Millions of them were produced during World War II. And he wrote a one-page memo for FDR, and in June 1940, FDR gave him his wish. He became the point person for developing new weapons. His goal was to use those weapons in this war. As Peter mentioned, there was not much stock in the uranium bomb in 1940, 1941, early even, because Bush didn't think it could be made to work or it couldn't be built in time, and he wasn't interested in anything that couldn't be built in time. But that committee from Britain came and said, as Peter has mentioned, you don't need much uranium, it can be done. About the time they came, Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union. So these two things tipped the balance for Bush. They were advancing very, very fast toward Moscow. They'd already surrounded Leningrad. It really looked like they were going to run the world. They were bombing London. They had conquered France. They had overrun Belgium and Holland, Denmark. And now the Soviet Union. So on October 9th, which I think is one of the most important days in modern history, Vannevar Bush basically changed his mind and thought the US should make a major effort to determine whether we could build a bomb, and so, if so, actually build it. He went to FDR and recommended that project. FDR just gave him a nod. It wasn't even a piece of paper, unlike 1940. It was amazing how informal it all was. And gave him the green light not only for the project, but the money to pursue it, because the atomic project was not cheap. So now we're talking June 1940, he became the science advisor, basically in charge of weapons to Roosevelt, a year and a half before Pearl Harbor. October 9th, he gets the green light for new weapons and the atomic bomb project 2 months before Pearl Harbor. Now, Bush wants to use weapons that he is in charge of developing or overseeing in this war. So in a way, if the bomb would be ready in time, if it would work, it would be used in this war. In spirit, in my mind, the decision was made on October 9th, 1941, almost 2 months before Pearl Harbor, because of the outlook and determination of the man who recommended the project to FDR and got the green light. That was the other thread. It was the establishment thread. As Peter mentioned, Truman, when he was vice president, was not told, unlike Henry Wallace, who was the previous vice president, who knew about the Manhattan Project. He was on the top policy committee. Truman was not even told that there's a Manhattan Project. So when Roosevelt died in early April 1945, Truman had no clue about the bomb. He didn't know about it. He didn't know, he had tried to find out as senator and failed. And he was quite upset about it. He was briefed on the 25th of April by Henry Stimson. And Henry Stimson, as Peter has told you, warned him that this is a bomb that could result in the destruction of civilization. But he also said this. He said, on the other hand, quote, if the problem of the proper use of this weapon can be solved, we would have the opportunity to bring the world into a pattern in which the peace of the world and our civilization can be saved. So this was in the science side, Vannevar Bush's idea, those who do the advanced weapons and martial science will rule the world. The foreign policy establishment. Now, Stimson was a Republican who was called out of retirement, if I'm remembering correctly, by FDR to be his Secretary of War. This is his view. Figure out the proper use of this weapon. Hiroshima was, in their view, the proper use of that weapon. So now we have a very different stream of thinking than Einstein's. Einstein's idea, and the idea of most of the emigres was, and Bush was not an emigre, he was born in, I think, in Massachusetts. Anyway, he lived most of his life in Massachusetts and then came to Washington 39 or 40. And the emigre scientists had the idea that Hitler should not have the bomb first. It should not be able to blackmail the world or the United States. This other idea was nuclear-tipped global control. Fast forward to December 1944, this Manhattan Project had its own spy mission. It was pretty much understood the war was going to be over soon. And it was pretty much understood that Hitler did not have a viable bomb project. At that time, the project was accelerated. It wasn't then that the decision was made to use the bomb on Japan. Germany had actually been de-targeted on May 5th, 1943, when the Military Policy Committee headed by Bush, no relation to the later presidents, I should add, they considered bomb targeting, and they thought if the bomb is a dud, Germany had Heisenberg, they could reverse engineer it and use it on London, for example. They initially targeted the Japanese fleet, a truck. The bomb was a dud, it would sink. And then when they were surer, they targeted Japanese cities, but that was much later. The Manhattan Project scientists continued to believe it was all about Germany. I interviewed many of the leading scientists who were still alive in 1995, and they did not know that Germany had been de-targeted on May 5th, 1943, though the fact was public in the fine print in the 1960s in the official history of the Manhattan Project. Groves, so Germany was not targeted after that. Groves actually wrote in April 1945, summarizing the Manhattan Project for President Truman, the target is and was always expected to be Japan. So always expected, in my mind, goes back to May 5th, 1943. Another very important date. Now, why is all this? There's another reason other than the fact we wound up in the nuclear age, why this is all very, very important. And it's so sad that it is so little known. In December 1944, as you know, the Manhattan Project built giant factories, uranium enrichment in Oak Ridge. There was an atomic pile in Chicago, where the first chain reaction happened in December 1942. And then the giant factory, basically set of installations in Hanford, Washington, on the banks of the Columbia River, where they took over indigenous land, as they did in New Mexico, to build nuclear reactors and vast chemical plants known as reprocessing plants. What happens is you put uranium in the nuclear reactor, you irradiate it with neutrons, some of it becomes plutonium, but you have to separate it from the highly radioactive waste you've created and the rest of the uranium. And so you throw it basically into a remotely operated, vast chemical separation plant to extract the plutonium. In December 1944, the large plutonium separation plant had not yet been completed or started. It was nearing completion, it was nearly complete. So no plutonium in quantity had yet been separated. There were only small quantities that they were working with for experiments to determine its properties in Los Alamos and Berkeley. And Seaborg was in charge of that in Berkeley. But no large quantities, no bomb usable quantities had been made by early December 1944. When Rotblat quit, he found out Germany doesn't have a viable bomb project. The bomb might be used otherwise on Japan, and in any case, he wanted to quit. He wanted no part of it. And as you know, he was the only one. The important thing is that the giant mess that has been created from plutonium separation, starting in the Manhattan Project, had not yet been created. Yes, there was some mess in Chicago. Yes, the reactors in Hanford had been started up in late November or early December, but no reprocessing had been. The dirtiest parts had not yet been. The day after Christmas in 1944, that changed. The waste, the highly radioactive toxic waste that would put into underground tanks is still there in Hanford 80 years later. Of course, a lot more was added because Hanford became one of the two centers of plutonium production in the United States. The other is in North Carolina. And tens of millions of gallons of radioactive waste still sit in those underground tanks in Hanford, Washington. 67 of those tanks have leaked. They are just 10 miles from the Columbia River, which is the lifeblood in terms of water of the Pacific Northwest. So in parallel with this story of the use of the bomb, there is the story of the mess that the nuclear bomb project, starting with the Manhattan Project, but then later spreading to the Soviet Union, has created throughout the world. Had Einstein's vision prevailed, Rotblat's vision prevailed, the project would have been stopped in December 1944. Purpose accomplished. But it was not, it was accelerated. So the future that might have been, we don't know whether it would have been, without the bomb was foreclosed. That possibility was done because there was a determination to use the bomb. The Trinity Test, you've heard about it from Tina. The Manhattan Project was accelerated. The bomb was used on Hiroshima. Before Hiroshima, Stalin had knowledge of the Manhattan Project. It didn't bother him too much. The Soviet Union had a nuclear project. It was quite small. They had other priorities during the war. When Hiroshima was announced to the world and the ability and determination of the US to use atomic weapons to destroy cities, it was a message to the Soviets. Groves said later that he conducted the project as if, quote, Russia was our enemy, and the project was conducted on that basis. Stalin got that message. He made an all-out effort to get the bomb. It involves spies, slave labor, 4 years, brilliant Soviet scientists like Kurchatov and Sakharov, who joined, I think, in 48, and a poisoned lake, Lake Karachay, which may still be so toxic that you get a deadly dose of radiation just standing on its banks, and poisoned the Techa River, which runs by the Mayak plant where the first Soviet plutonium was made. So what was unleashed with Hiroshima was foretold before. If you go ahead with Hiroshima without informing or involving the Soviets and telling them we're going to do this, we have this project, you already knew about it anyway. That's why he got the message so very quickly. He understood it only too well. We've created vast global radioactive archipelago of radioactive wastelands. We wrote about that. John told you about our book with the international physicians. It started actually with the Congo, which was brutally ruled by Belgium. Belgians were extracting uranium for the radium at the time, actually. So they had a pile of very rich uranium ore. Einstein had already mentioned it in the letter that he signed. Congo is the place for uranium. And that uranium created its own little set of contaminated sites. It was first stored in Staten Island. Then it was sent to Tonawanda, New York, in upstate New York. Some of it went to Cleveland, Ohio, where it was turned into uranium hexafluoride. That went to Oak Ridge, where it was enriched. And then that was turned into the Hiroshima bomb. Some of it went to Ames, Iowa, where they converted it into metal. That metal went into the atomic pile in Chicago, and also together with a much larger amount of metal, which was made in the Mallinckrodt chemical plant in downtown St. Louis. They were processing plutonium and uranium into metal. All that went to Hanford, and some of that became plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb. The first people probably to get very sick from radioactivity were, it would be my guess, in Ames, Iowa, and some of the people in Chicago got significant doses of radiation from the atomic pile. It was, one shot, that chain reaction. What used to happen with these uranium metal making is they had uranium tetrafluoride. They mixed it with metal flakes and put it in a crucible and heated it. Sometimes the crucible would blow up several times a week, sometimes, because the process was very delicate and was not really fully under control. Even after the war, this continued to happen in Fernald, Ohio, where they made uranium metal for the Savannah River and Hanford sites. So the first lung contamination seriously actually occurred long before Hiroshima, years before Hiroshima, before the Trinity Test in Ames, Iowa, and downtown St. Louis. The Marshall Islands were the first test site after the Cold War. 67 bomb tests, 108.5 megatons. It was more than 100 times greater than all of the atmospheric tests done in Nevada. And as you've heard, the Nevada atmospheric tests were pretty devastating for the downwinders. The recommendation in Trinity was, as Tina told you, not to conduct another test like Trinity within 150 miles of human population. Rongelap was less than 110 miles from Bikini, which was, as you know, evacuated. The 1954 Bravo thermonuclear bomb test. So you're not supposed to conduct a test of 1/50th of a megaton within 150 miles of human population. The Bravo thermonuclear bomb was more than 700 times as powerful as the Trinity bomb, 14 times more than all the atmospheric tests in Nevada. It produced a hotspot in Mexico City, thousands of miles to the east, and also in Colombo, Sri Lanka, thousands of miles to the west of the Marshall Islands. Just one test. And the Marshallese, of course, have suffered terribly, not just cancers, the loss of economy, the loss of their traditional social and economic structure, the traditional fishing grounds. It's a whole very sad story. I've written a lot about it. I won't dwell on it at length here because I want to give you the arc of my story of what happened and the road not taken. In the first decades after the bomb, the US did human radiation experiments to gauge the effects of radiation, to aid in nuclear war planning. Some of the Marshallese were also treated pretty much as experimental subjects to see, they live in a radioactive environment, how will it go through their food and their bodies, and, we'll measure their urine, the explicit minutes to the effect of treating them like experimental subjects in the Atomic Energy Commission's archives, the Division of Biology and Medicine, 1956 minutes. Human experiments went on in the United States. Plutonium injections without medical purpose, irradiation of prisoners' testicles in Walla Walla, Washington, pregnant women being fed radioactive food, children being fed radioactive cereal. That continued till 1972 or so. There was a commission to investigate it in 1994. We know more about the U.S. It doesn't mean that the U.S. was necessarily worse than anybody else. There's the tragedies in Kazakhstan, there's the tragedies in the Congo, French Polynesia, the indigenous lands in Australia, testing in Algeria, and really uranium mining and milling throughout the world. 500 abandoned mines in Navajo Nation lands alone. I'll end very soon in about 2 minutes. There's a global toll. IPPNW and IER estimated 430,000 additional cancer deaths worldwide due to atmospheric testing to the end of this century and more beyond that. Genetic harm was understood early on. The California Engineer editors wrote an editorial saying that testing would produce, quote, an additional 6,000 babies born with major birth defects throughout the world. So the US is going to use nuclear weapons to control the world and at the same time arrogate to itself to harm those very children and maim them knowingly through nuclear testing. And the editorial went on to say that, quote, you must weigh this acknowledged risk of 6,000 babies with major birth defects with the demonstrated need of the United States for a nuclear arsenal to fight what they call brush fire wars like the Korean War. So let me close by kind of reflecting on this problem that has arisen. It's not a one-dimensional problem of the horrible destructive nature of nuclear weapons. There's a moral presumption that the 5 nuclear weapon states who are guardians of world's peace and security, presumably as members of the Security Council, they had a moral presumption that they could inflict damage on the children of the world so that they could have military power. There's the fact of the multi-generational health and environmental harm that has been created. So it may be that we have gained security, probably not, right, as you've heard, and we're in constant peril of being blown up. But certainly future generations are going to live with the legacy and not benefit from it. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. And it's hard to know, about the determination to control the world, knowing about the civilization ending nuclear arms race. And let me end by the second last thing I'd like to say is that in 1990, there was a chance after the Cuban Missile Crisis to know how close we all came to annihilation. They did not know until 1990 when they exchanged notes with the Soviets about what had really happened. Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet submarine commander, had really stopped the use of a Soviet nuclear bomb during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that is what saved us all. Despite the end of the Cold War, the U.S., the people who ran the U.S. really saw, in my interpretation, a new opportunity to have basically a monopoly. They basically behaved as if the Soviet Union is so defeated they don't have nuclear weapons. But the Soviet Union was not defeated. The Soviet Union was defeated politically, it fell apart, but the United States did not win the Cold War because the Soviet Union, Russia now, could still destroy the US in 15 minutes. We'll never know what would have happened if the project had been stopped in December 1944. The Soviets had been told, we did this, we stopped it because we don't think we should have nuclear weapons. We'll never know if there would have been a post-war world without nuclear weapons. It would have been a possibility. It would have been hard, I think, to realize it. But that possibility was foreclosed by Hiroshima. Rothblatt's, you know the famous poem about the road not taken. There were 2 roads. There was Einstein's idea, no Hitler blackmail. That would have stopped the project in December 1944. Rothblatt took that road, nobody else did, and we wound up where we are today, 80 years later. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Arjun, for that great presentation. If you can hold on for a while, it's now about 8:30, so we'll take about 30 minutes for questions and answers. I think the way we'll do this, I'm going to call on a couple of people I want to recognize for their comments first, and then we're going to let people raise their hands. We only have about a half an hour, so people should take that in to consideration when you ask a question or comment. So first of all, I'd like to call on Ivana Hughes, who's the president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and she collaborates a lot with Peter Kuznick. So Ivana, could you reflect on what you've heard tonight?
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for calling on me and for organizing this very important gathering. I'm so pleased to be here with everybody and really touched very deeply by Tina's and Mary's personal reflections and remarks, and also inspired by Peter's and Arjun's comments about the very important history, including, of course, hearing from Arjun that really the 1945 was just the beginning, and the nuclear age continued the pace, bringing devastation far beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I wanted to make just really two comments. The first is that I wanted just to add a tiny little bit to the history that we've heard about the scientists. So my personal background, I'm also a scientist. And in addition to my work at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, I teach at Columbia University. And Columbia was actually the home of I.I. Rabi, whom Peter mentioned. Peter mentioned him in the context of guessing, having the closest guess to the energy yield of the Trinity Test. But there's more to know about Rabi. And if you've seen the film Oppenheimer, you'll remember the sort of the chubby guy who played by David Krumholtz, who really, I think Christopher Nolan, in some sense, he absolutely gave Rabi credit where credit was due, but almost brought in kind of multiple scientists and things that were being said and done at the time to make him the symbol of the conscience of the nuclear age. And so, among other things, Rabi actually did really refuse. Joseph Rotblat walked away from the Manhattan Project, but Rabi refused to join it, saying that he didn't want 300 years of physics to culminate in the making of the bomb. He was actually, his Nobel Prize in 1944 was given for the discovery of nuclear magnetic resonance, which is why we have MRI. I'm gonna guess that a lot of people in this group had an MRI done at some point. I've had MRIs done. So for that, we can thank Rabi. And so there were really those voices very early on recognizing, I think in some sense, you know, that sentence from Rabi almost says it all, right? That here we are with the ability to learn about the universe, to do good things, and yet we're going to make a bomb to kill people. And of course, it was already by the end of 1945 that Rabi and Oppenheimer actually recognized that continued national possession of nuclear weapons was going to end in a disaster, and they wanted to have nuclear weapons be put under international control. So I'm going to leave the history there and tell you that in these very, very challenging times, which they certainly are, I see sort of two bright things, and I think the hope and light is very important in dark times. The first really wonderful thing that's happened over the past year, and Peter already mentioned this, is Nihon Hidankyo winning the Nobel Peace Prize. So that was a very well-deserved recognition, a little bit of I think visibility and awareness raising for the disarmament movement, incredibly important, and just incredibly important. I think Mary and Tina are doing this kind of work themselves, but for those of us who don't have that personal connection, but work on disarmament, people like the Hibakusha are really, they are the light, and they are the guide. And I always think if they can do this work, then surely the rest of us have to as well. But I want to highlight a second thing. One of the things that came out of the Hibakusha movement from the very beginning was the notion that you'd want to actually eliminate nuclear weapons. They understood from that personal experience that these weapons had to go. And so the second positive thing that I want to stress is the fact that we now do have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, not the NPT that you always hear about, but the treaty that actually aims to eliminate nuclear weapons. That treaty was negotiated in 2017. It entered into force in 2021, and it currently has essentially half of the UN member states as having joined the treaty, as signatories or states parties. So there is some good news out there, and we just have to keep fighting the important fight until we really can eliminate this this threat from our planet. So thank you all for this very inspiring webinar, and thank you, John, for including me in the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ivana. So I think that what I'll do is, because I'm already seeing some hands, I'm going to call on one more person to give comments. I want to call on Kynan Thistlethwaite. And
Can I just say something very quickly first?
Quickly, yes, sure.
People don't appreciate it. I mean, I love what Ivana had to say, and it was positive. But she actually, you might have seen in the background, her husband is a Columbia physics professor, and they live in Rabi's former apartment. So if you got that view in the background, that was Rabi's apartment during the years we've been talking about, until much later.
Thank you, Peter. I was going for brevity. I was going to skip that part, but Peter has also been in our apartment, so he knows. Thank you for adding that. Thank you.
I hope it's rent controlled, Ivana.
Columbia is not a great landlord, but I'll leave it at that.
All right, that was a joke. So let me call on Kynan Thistlethwaite, and so he's a young volunteer. I'm told. I've never met him, but Pat Salisbury told me good things about him, and we do need youth in this struggle. He's a volunteer with the Schiller Institute, and they put on a program every Friday. They have on people like Ray McGovern and a lot of really interesting guests that talk about geopolitical stuff. So, Keenan, if you can talk briefly about your work.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, John, for giving me the opportunity. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
I appreciate listening to everyone. I wanted to share with you some of the work I've done in my comments. I was hoping to hear from Hideko Tamura, but hopefully another time. I've actually been working closely with a Japanese author by the name of Dr. Akiko Mikamo. She's the daughter of the Hiroshima survivor, Shinji Mikamo, who he was 1,200 meters from the epicenter of the blast with his father, Fukuichi, but they had both survived miraculously. And in her book, which is entitled 815, A True Story of Survival and Forgiveness from Hiroshima, she describes this terrible struggle for survival, which her father endured. And she's written the book and made a film based off of it, which I've had the pleasure of organizing screenings of in the New York City area. And it's done for the purpose of actually teaching future generations about the horrors of nuclear war, but it's a testament as to actually how to achieve durable peace with nations. Shinji Mikamo, he went through a terrifying ordeal to survive, but he actually came out of it with a commitment to the goodness and love for mankind. And he believed that only things like evil, anger, and hatred would only lead to destruction and ruin. And he had told his daughter, as described in the book, I'll just quote it for you real quick. He said, "Our city was forever changed. There could be no doubt of that. But I saw nothing good to come from holding tight to animosity, from focusing on the past instead of the future. No good would come from narrowing our eyes to the complicated and vehement disposition that had engaged so much of the world at war. These were the blinders that provoked conflict, not soothed it. I wanted to look forward. I wanted to see enemies become allies. I wanted peace." And end quote. But Shinji has worked so hard to achieve such a world. He's passed away, but despite the fact that he had, and you can kind of see it there, he believed that the use of the atomic bomb was unjust, but he also refused to submit to hate against the United States for dropping it. And the Schiller Institute, which I work with, they're committed to the policy of a new security and development architecture among all nations. And we're organizing for this in collaborations with leaders across the world, such as Dr. Naledi Pandor. She's the former Minister of International Relations and Cooperation from South Africa. And we're doing this because it's only through a commitment to economic development and win-win cooperation that the threat of nuclear war will be abated. And if the US, the nations of Europe, and others were to work with the BRICS nations who are seeking to build a multipolar world as opposed to a unipolar one, we could actually set the basis for avoiding future wars. I'll just end by quoting from our chairwoman, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, from her 10 Principles for a New Security and Development Architecture. And the last of these are totally in line with Shinji Mikamo's philosophy of the goodness of mankind. And it states, the basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good and capable to infinitely perfect the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul, and that all evil is a result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome. A new order is emerging involving the vast majorities of the countries of the global south. Europe and the US must not fight this effort, but by joining hands with the developing countries, cooperate to shape the next epoch of the development of the human species to become a renaissance of the highest and most noble expressions of creativity. So I'll just leave off with that. We're continuing our work with Dr. Akiko Mikamo for those interested, since it's the 80th anniversary of the bombings, and we're going to show her film to more people to teach these lessons of forgiveness and empathy, which everyone must understand. And I would also add that people should join in on the International Peace Coalition meetings, which are every Friday at 11 a.m. So thanks, John, for letting me speak.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kynan. And this is just a reminder to all of us that we need to be reaching out to the youth, because the youth are our future. Many of us are gray beards, in our 70s and even 80s. So I'm really glad you could join us, Kynan. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to raised hands, and I'm going to go with the first one first. And so it was Moji Aga was the first hand up. So Moji, if you could take a minute or two and ask a question or give a comment.
Sure. Hi, thank you. It's a wonderful gathering. Thank you for organizing it. My name is Moji Aga. I'm a Sufi monk, a dervish, and a peace activist from Iran. Natanz is my hometown. Natanz is Iran's main enrichment facility. And one of my cousins lost her house in Tehran as a result of the Israeli attack on the country. And Natanz, my hometown where my ancestry is buried, for including my parents, may have been contaminated. So I am worried about that. But what I'm doing is a I'm a co-founder of Peace-Seeking Iranian Veterans. I'm an associate member of Veterans for Peace in the United States. And we have a proposal called Roadmap Toward a Global Iran Peace Agreement. We are trying to find a way to plead with the Pope, with the new Pope, to become a special intermediary in these negotiations, which are being sabotaged by Israel constantly, including the attack on Iran, the main purpose of which was to destroy any possibility of US and Iran move towards some kind of rapprochement. So I've left my contact information. Please, especially if you know of a direct or indirect way of somehow contacting the Vatican so that this project, the existence of which is learned by the Pope, please contact me. Thank you so much. Sorry if I talked too long.
No, that's fine. You talked just right. So I'm going to actually step out of line. I'm going to get to the hands, but I want to recognize someone who's come on, who is Professor Takao Takahara, and he's with Meiji Gaikun Institute in Japan. So this will be early morning for him. And he's the director of the International Peace Research Institute there. So professor from Japan, it's a bright sunrise. Welcome. And if you could take 2 or 3 minutes to give a greeting to the group. You're muted. Unmute.
Hello. I could only join you just a few minutes ago, so I'm afraid I don't have anything relevant to share with you.
Well,
But I surely share with you the desire for peace and nuclear disarmament. So yes, I look forward to joining you again. But at this time, just my best regards to all of you. Thank you very much for the time.
Yes, and thank you for getting up early. So I just wanted to recognize you. So let me go on to the next.
May I just say that I have posted in the chat, and we'll do it again, the link to the recording that is currently going up on the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom US YouTube channel. And if you can access YouTube, then you can see this and you can respond. Thank you.
And that's good. And Professor, so that you know, we heard from the descendants of the Downwinders at Trinity and also the other American Hibakusha voices. So, and we'll be sending a delegation to Japan. Ellen Thomas is going to be going representing Women's International League. So again, thank you for joining us. And now I'm going to go to Jan.
John, let me interrupt again
Yes.
very quickly to say hi to Taka, because he's co-sponsored some of my peace tours, and he's brought his students along to go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki along with my students. So it's always great to see you.
And that's Peter's reminding me that that's something from the year 2000 to about the year 2015. Every year, the Hiroshima Committee sent a youth along with an adult to Hiroshima to meet with the Hibakusha and to meet with young Japanese peace activists. So that's something else that Taka, you and Peter and I have in common, working with the youth. So now let me go on to Jan Bendor. Jan.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful gathering. I am a member of the Detroit Area Alliance to halt Fermi 3. We stopped that massive, dangerous nuclear facility. but we are very fearful of what they might put in its place. But I'm here also because of my own personal history. And I have a question that has not been addressed. I'm very happy that the RECA has been extended, and it has been extended to include New Mexico victims. My parents, both of them, were on Roswell Air Force Base on July 16th, 1945. My father was there to be trained as a B-29 pilot. He'd already been B-17, B-24. He'd been all over Europe, and he was being trained to be sent to the Pacific. He knew nothing about the nuclear plans. And so on that morning at 5:30 a.m., he was on the tarmac when the sky became morning instantly, and he radioed the tower and said, "What the heck was that?" And they said, "Lieutenant, we don't know what." And so he and his crew took off, did their
Miss Bendo, you're on mute.
How did she get on me?
Somehow you went on mute. You have to
Okay, I changed it again. Thank you.
Now you're fine.
Okay, so at 5:23, the sky became the sun, and my father said to the tower, "What the hell was that?" And they said, "Lieutenant, we don't know what it was." And so he and his crew flew through the nuclear cloud because that was their order to practice the bombing run. Meanwhile, my mother was on the ground at the Air Force Base, and she died 4 years later from thyroid cancer, and my father died a number of years later from myelodysplasia syndrome, which is what happens when strontium-90 attacks your bone marrow. Right. And you don't have blood vessels, you don't have blood cells, you don't have white cells. He eventually bled to death. It's a really bad way to go. And a lot of high altitude pilots still suffer from this. And I guess my question is, I love the fact that RECA has been extended to include people who were in New Mexico, because my parents were there. But what about all, they've got 19 diseases, but what about myelodysplasia syndrome, which if you have it long enough, will get you leukemia or anemia or any number of diseases that result from the fact that your bone marrow can't produce any cells anymore. And I'm happy to be referred to somebody who can explain this to me. But I've been working on this for 20 years to figure out what killed my parents.
So Arjun, would you answer that?
Well, I don't know about this particular disease. I'm not a medical doctor. I've tried to educate myself as much as possible about the impacts of radiation. The strontium-90 definitely does go to the bone, as you know, Ms. Bendor, and it does impact the immune system. That's where the stem cells of the immune system are made. So your story is, certainly scientifically plausible. That's the most that I can say. I would bet you a very nice bottle of wine that you know a lot more about this than I do as we sit, this particular thing, as we sit here today, because you've looked at it so much and you've been personally impacted by
Well,
it.
thank you, sir. Thank you.
If you put the name of the disease in the chat, all I can promise is I will add it to the things that I don't know about yet and will research. Thyroid definitely.
I did listed as
Oh,
myelodysplasia syndrome. It also
myelodysplasia
killed
syndrome.
Carl
Okay.
Sagan.
Yeah.
It killed
All right.
Marianne Mahaffey, who was the president of the Detroit City Council, because she had been a social worker assigned to a Native American reservation at the time of the fallout.
Yeah.
I'm finding a lot of people who were killed by this exposure.
The fallout was pretty terrible, and your father flying through the fallout cloud, probably brought radioactivity home. Of course, in a fresh bomb, there would have been, and not only iodine-131, and that is pretty deadly by itself, but there are shorter isotopes of iodine that are even more radioactive that are created. They kind of disappear in, a few hours and days. And then iodine-131 has a half-life of 8 days, and so it hangs around for a couple of months. But and then there are lots of other short-lived isotopes. So it's many Air Force during the nuclear testing days, it was routine for Air Force pilots to fly through these clouds, as you probably know, and they'd land these planes and they would hose them down. And I have seen photographs where the people who were hosing down the planes, there was no protection for the water, or environmental contamination. They were not wearing masks to protect from the radioactivity that was becoming. It was, it was pretty, it was not very careful way, even if you want to develop a bomb. So I'm very sorry that your family went through this. A lot of things have been ignored. In Tina's case, and I've talked with Tina about this, they collected water from the roofs in barrels, so the fallout on the roofs would have gone into the barrels. And I have explicitly mentioned strontium-90 to her because it would settle in the bottom of the barrel, so it wasn't the fallout one and done. Every time you collected, even if the roof was clean, every time you collected water from the roof, it went into a contaminated barrel. And the laundry that was out, people have complained about that. So now children are sleeping on it. You're dusting it because there's dust on it, and you think, you have to dust it before you use it. There are so many corners of the radiation and fallout problem that have not been examined. I'm currently finishing a report on the reproductive impacts of ionizing radiation, especially focused on fallout. I'm nearly done. It'll probably be a couple of months. I'm sorry to take so long and not yet answer your question even. So, but I hope I've helped a little.
A breath of fresh air. I listed my documentary, a 6-minute documentary about what happened to my family. And you might want to especially pay attention to what happened to my stepmother when she tried to have babies, but my father was exposed to radiation, and his ability to reproduce was totally compromised, and they had 2 defective children. It was very tragic, and I think you would want to take note of that, because I think that happened to a lot of service personnel who were exposed.
Ma'am, could you please put that link in the chat again? I can't find it.
It is the link to my Vimeo is in the chat. And I thank you for paying attention to that, because
thank you.
It was a huge tragedy for my family, and I had no brothers or sisters as the result. I'm just really lucky that I got in between the exposures, and so far I'm okay, but it was awful for my parents.
Jan, thank you for sharing that story with us. It's just a reminder that, the bomb, it killed and it keeps on killing. And it's stories like yours and the other survivors that, gives us the strength to go on and to do the work we're doing because, Arjun and I have, devoted, and Peter have devoted and many of the others on this call have devoted our entire lives to this movement. And it's people like you that give us the strength and the courage to move forward. So thank you very much for your story.
Thank you, John.
And-
We stopped the Fermi 3 in Detroit.
So very, very briefly, and then I'm going to go to Peter Cook and to Leona. But I was a member of the Arbor Alliance, and we were the major group that fought against Fermi 2. And so for those who don't know, Fermi 1 was the first major attempt at a breeder reactor. There was a partial meltdown. Fermi 2 was built, and now they want to build Fermi 3. So you're carrying on the tradition. If you see Mike, tell him I said hi. And I'm going to go on. I'm going to call on Peter next.
Okay, thank you very much for tonight, everyone. I'd like to direct this to to Dr. Kuznick, if I may, and qualify very quickly. I'm a former Marine, and I'm a former student of Peter Kuznick's, a wonderful teacher all those years ago. And just to what John was saying about engaging the youth, I'm going to be going on a base tour to talk to the U.S. Marines about literacy. And when I was in the Marine Corps, there wasn't something called the Commandant's Reading List, and there is now. So I wanted to ask Dr. Kuznick if he could, if he had something he wanted to tell the Marines that they should pay attention to, and what would that be beyond the Constitution? I wondered if there was some advice I could pocket and distribute when I get to these bases.
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
Tell them, among other things, they should read your new book.
Right. Yeah.
I want to give a plug for.
Well, yeah. Thank you for
copy, you
that.
should hold
Only
it up.
art can save us.
I would tell them it's a good idea to not be a Marine. When Bobby Mueller, the head of the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, used to come to my class and talk about Vietnam, he would tell them that if you wanted to kill, you join the infantry. If you wanted to get killed, you join the Marines. Bobby was of the 7 lieutenants who went in with him. He was the last one medevaced out after he got a bullet through his chest and was paralyzed from his chest down. So I think that the only way to prevent the Marines from being cannon fodder is to stop all these wars. Specific advice for the Marines, given your experience, you know a lot more than I do about the Marines and what to tell them. But, the United States has been involved in one war after another, and now we're gearing up to go to war against China. As Hegseth said, we have to end the war in Ukraine quickly so we can focus on the real enemy, China. And I mean, that's the thinking that's going on, and it's very dangerous.
Thank you,
I
sir.
agree. I agree. Very dangerous. So Leona Morgan has her hand up, and then I'm thinking at that point I'm going to turn the program over to Ellen. So Leona, you have a question or a comment?
I have a comment. If can you hear me okay?
We hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for the information, and hello to Arjun and everyone. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My family is from I'm Diné, or Navajo as people know us, but we call ourselves Diné. And my family's from an area where there was mining. And so I got into this fight in 2007. So I've been doing this work for a while. Right now I'm 44 years old, and I work with a lot of young people. But I just wanted to uplift that this day, you know, we're talking about Trinity and everything with weapons, but I really want to just emphasize that we also need to talk about nuclear energy, because right now we're dealing with a big push for new uranium mining for nuclear energy. And I know some folks, especially in Japan, like to separate the so-called peacetime use of nuclear with the wartime or military use. But we have to keep talking about nuclear energy, especially because groups like ICANN, and others will not. And this is something that's problematic for my people, because it doesn't matter where the uranium goes. Our people are going to suffer the impacts of radioactive contamination, health, reproductive issues, and then also, you know, right now we're dealing with the fast tracking of uranium mines, or fast tracking of everything Trump is doing, but that includes 4 uranium mines in New Mexico. They greenlit 1 mine in Utah in 14 days. And so right now we're being attacked anywhere there's uranium, we're under attack. And this includes places like Church Rock. So Church Rock, New Mexico, this was the site of the July 16th, 1979 spill. So I don't know how many of you are aware, but July 16, it's a horrific day in history, because we're dealing with 2 nuclear disasters in New Mexico, both that happened on July 16, both around 5:30 in the morning. And so Saturday, in a couple days, we're going to be in Church Rock, and the community there, they live in between 3 uranium mines and a uranium mill, all less than a mile away. And so they're doing their big event they do every year. Folks can come out next year if you're so inclined to learn about the uranium issue, the uranium spill, and the cleanup efforts, and all of that. So I just wanted to highlight July 16th it has 2 anniversaries, and our Diné people are still dealing with the impacts. Thank you.
So Leona's talking about the Rio Puerco spill, where a uranium tailings pond broke through the dam and contaminated over 100 acres of the Puerco River. And to make things worse, there was a situation on the Hopi and Navajo and Diné Navajo reservation where there was a division of land and a forced relocation of traditional Diné sheep herders, because they wanted to mine the coal and the uranium and the oil. It was the largest forced dislocation of people since World War II and the Japanese internment, and the people were basically forced to settle along the Puerco River. It was called the New Lands, but it was all contaminated soil. So I worked very closely with Roberta Blackgoat and Danny Blackgoat and Catherine Smith and many others. So Leona, I'm very familiar with your story, and our committee, Hiroshima Peace Committee, is opposed to nuclear power and nuclear weapons. We feel that every nuclear power plant is a bomb factory, and that the inherent dangers are too great. So thank you so much for your story as well.
Yeah, thank you for letting me share. Thanks, everyone.
And now I have another hand is up from a phone number. So the person calling from 773, can you speak?
Hi, Jake is my name, calling from Chicago. Yeah, I just want to elaborate on that too. The Chernobyl reactors were dual-purpose reactors. They're really military reactors. These are all the reactors in Ukraine, dating back to the old Soviet Union. They're dual reactors. They're really military reactors designed for military purposes. The electricity is just a byproduct. So the 2 industries were part and parcel. I mean, they historically go together. I'm talking about nuclear power and nuclear weapons. They go
Right.
Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program was really just a cover for the nuclear weapons program.
Yeah, you're pretty much preaching to the choir here on that. We get you for sure. So appreciate your comment. And if it's all right with everybody, I'd like to turn it over to Ellen. She's our co-host. She's the one that started this Zoom. WILPF, partners with us to reach out. We got almost 100 people tonight. And so Ellen, if you could kind of, if I could hand the host job over to you, and maybe you can take us home and introduce the video you're going to be showing to end the program. Ellen.
Okay, yes. Well, it's been very educational, as always, with this group of people. And I'm honored and pleased to have been able to participate in it. And I know that WILPF is going to appreciate having it on our WILPF US Today YouTube channel, because, and by the way, you all should know that there's a lot of good stuff on that channel, so you might want to check it out. We've been on for a long time, so I think that anything that I have to say would be redundant, and other than check out prop1.org, prop1.org, which is about Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill, the Nuclear Weapons Abolition and Conversion Act, and talking about using the money from nuclear weapons to convert the war machines and provide for carbon-free, nuclear-free energy, prop1.org. I'll put it in the chat, and be sure you save the chat. I want to share a video that was done in 2020 by Democracy Now! Of Hideko Tamura Snider, who is a member of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and lives in Oregon. And she was planning on being here, but she was in a painful experience with a reporter, and she doesn't feel like she's capable of telling her story anymore. And so I'm very glad that we have a couple of versions of her story. The Democracy Now! One is shortest, but there's another one that she and I did back in 2020 that I put the link in the chat for, that is an hour long, and it's very detailed and very beautiful. So I suggest, if you'd like to, and I also put her email in the chat. So if you would like to write to her, I'm sure she'd be glad to hear from you. Okay, so let me share this. Anybody want to say something while I'm doing that?
Just to thank everyone for attending this Zoom. I mean, the panelists and also the audience for listening, the really good comments. We need to educate ourselves. We need to educate our neighbors, our communities. We need to continue to organize. And so as we move forward, let's listen to the words of Hideko Tamura.
Oops, where did it go? There it is.
There we go. All right, thank you, everybody.
She was 10 years old when the bomb was dropped. Her memoir recounting the moment is titled One Sunny Day, A Child's Memories of Hiroshima. She's a retired psychiatric social worker, founder of One Sunny Day Initiatives, a peace education organization. She's joining us from Medford, Oregon. We welcome you to Democracy Now! It's an honor to have you with us, Hideko Tamura Snider. Can you go back 75 years ago, 8:15 in the morning in your city of Hiroshima? Tell us where you were and what happened next.
Thank you, Amy, for inviting me. Yes, I remember. Even though over 75 years, just like yesterday. I was the happiest child, just home from Country Haven from the night before, thinking so fortunate to be home. The morning was very sunny, birds were chirping, butterflies over flowers. And I was leaning over in my own house with my back to the garden, reading a book. First at 7:30 was a warning siren, but the radio I turned on said, a plane, 3 planes came and turned around and went away. It's safe now. Go back to work. It was safe now. Go back to work so we could resume our daily affairs. And suddenly there was a flash in my peripheral vision. I jumped on my feet and turned around, and simultaneously, practically, with the flash, came a humongous, deafening sound. So huge. I had never, ever heard. And went on just resounding with a huge sound. And luckily, my mother had taught me what to do if something akin to a bomb hitting our house or garden directly, to try to find very sturdy furniture and place myself between, which I did. She said, likely, even if the house collapsed on top of us, there will be a small room left. And I tried to hang on, but I couldn't even squat. The shaking was so huge in whichever way, and thermal wind from the explosion was so violent. Everything was hitting me, even if I was between 2 sturdy furniture. So I was under the wreckage. I think it was pitch dark. I could not see anything. And I think the sound of it, I did not pass out. I wish that I did. So I remember the sensation, the color, and the smell like yesterday. I think it went on in the pitch dark almost 10 or 15 minutes. And when the sound subsided, I found myself under the debris. The house was well built with large pillars, so the roof did not come down flat on top of me. But I was not able to get out, and it was an effort trying to move towards where there was a light coming and somehow crawl to get from under the debris. And I was sure that it was one bomb hit our yard. But when we came at, it was a household, the family of the Tamura industry. My grandfather, who had passed away by that time, was the chair of a multinational corporation, and Tamura industry name, I noticed that in the map of the Allied forces, American military map, had Tamura industry clearly marked. I suppose for all incendiary attacks and so forth, they would mark factories, you know, to aim. And so we were one of them, and our house was fairly close to it. When I came up outside, I found myself huge shards of glass were stuck in my foot. And I was an only child, not given to efficient self-care. The smallest scar, I would run to my mother, help me, mother, a little bruise. So I had no idea what to do. I was just terribly, frightened. You couldn't walk around with it. So, Tamura household was filled with Tamil family, extended relations. I asked an aunt, "Oh, Auntie, please help me. This horrible thing on my foot." She was not able to help me. Everyone was scarred, bruised, and my father's older brother, Uncle Hisao, who took over the Tamura industry, had barely made it back to the house and was sitting and screaming to us, "It is the end. End has come." And gashing cuts from the middle of his throat. I think he had more glass shards than everybody. In the factory, the glasses, when, it was destroyed, stuck all over his body. And he was bleeding from it and bleeding all over. It was a really very scary sight, as was when I mustered my courage. Nobody is going to help me. I am the only one who can do. And with trembling hand, washed around it after I very slowly picked this huge glass out of my leg, realizing it's the first time I had to do something this awful and this scary, and knew, looking back on it, it was the last day of my childhood. It's a really long story. Leaving this scene by myself because the heat of radiation was so strong, multiply by it from the heat that will melt steel so much more and turn the woods on fire and turn buildings on fire. And across the street went with a huge sound, the block full of flame. And I realized we're going to be surrounded and burned to death if we don't escape. And my mother's instruction was, get away from under the debris, go to the river and save yourself, staying by the river and escape along the river. And Hiroshima had several rivers, 7, from a major river coming in and pouring into the inland sea. So that's where I headed. In front of the gate were women on the ground reaching out to me. And these first ladies I saw on the ground bleeding and not even sitting, crawling, were speaking in Korean. that I could understand from the gesture, but I was only a child. I've never been hurt the way I was, or seen anything like this, or the house come down. You know, a child has this feeling your parents are always going to be there, and your room is going to be there, and you know, all your books and your world, you don't picture it to change, even though we had been evacuated, and my mother had told me, and I know the B-2900s would go over our sky, and we were in the war, but the child, you know, can't imagine anything changing that drastic, and people dying and bleeding and raising hands and begging, please help. And there was nothing I could do. I was needing a help myself. I don't know how much you like to know, because it's a long story about fleeing that day.
Well, Ms. Hideko Tamura Snider, thank you so much for that extremely powerful account. We wanted to know if you could say a little about what happened to your mother and to your siblings, and also the ongoing health impacts of radiation, of the dropping of this nuclear bomb on Hiroshima.
Okay. I never wanted to accept it, but the last she was seen was screaming as the heavy concrete, a part of the building, falling on her. She was buried alive and burned alive at barely 30 years of age. A beautiful woman and very loving. I was an only child, therefore no sibling, but I had a sibling-like playmate, beloved cousin. I lived under the same cousin Hideko. The last he was seen, he was with over 8,000 children at ground zero, barely being able to walk, but a classmate of his, months after the explosion, told us. He caught up with him, aren't you Tamura? Because, you know, all his clothes are burned and skin hanging. But the shape of his head, he sort of kind of recognized it must be my cousin. And he said, yes. And so the two started to walk a little bit. My cousin was barely making it. Then the plane came back. And we all thought that they came to shoot, like in the other kinds of attack.
Hideko Tamura, you suffered radiation sickness. Can you describe what that was like? You're a child.
Oh, yes, yes. I was caught up with my cousin's story. I'm sorry. I loved him so much that I just slowed down. I was covered with boils in August afterwards. And then suddenly I started to run very high fever, off the chart. Hair falling, stomach trouble. And I think I bordered life and death for weeks. And then finally it came down. but followed with jaundice. My eyes were completely yellowed, and you could tell, even though, you know, Asian skin tends toward golden, I was totally yellow, in a sort of much yellowish hue. And I was exhausted, like a liver trouble, you know, jaundice. I had no energy to even walk around, and I would sit where I was with my relations, where we took refuge. I was not able to go to a school. I missed most of my school days because of that. It was in a sort of like a top of the mountain type of a place in a town called Kabe, quite a bit away from Hiroshima. And I noticed where I was, you know, exhausted and ailing. Some of the people who had been in Hiroshima were dying with thyroid blowing up, high fever, and then bleeding from all orifices and having red spots all over. We didn't know, you know, we were even worried about mosquito bites if it was a start of the radiation sickness. We didn't have that word. We didn't know it was atom bomb related, because only those people who barely survived, but not really. It was like you were not well. People suddenly then died. Even those who came to look for their kins into the city had the similar kind of a reaction.
Hideko, Tamura, Snider,
Yeah.
Astoundingly, you would ultimately come to the United States to go to college, Bennett College in North Carolina, and you then got training as a psychiatric social worker. You live in Portland. It's 75 years ago today, as you have told your story to people, to students, to community groups. What message do you have for President Trump today, as many fear the beginning of a new nuclear arms race?
Well, you know, I came to a conclusion, all survivors did. The people of Hiroshima now would like to issue message that this is a horrific bomb, so harmful and inhumane that a human race cannot live with it. And we want to get that message out to everyone. And my way as a former clinical social worker is to encourage two former enemies, especially, to come closer in what I call collective healings, because there seems to be still anger tied up about the Pacific War against Japanese. And that means they're not healed either. And in our attempt to heal, we have to promote, don't let this happen to you. This is horrible. I chair One Sunny Day initiatives to do that, and I try to bring that which would encourage seeking solutions and seeking treaties and seeking collective approach to be able to live in peace in the world. However, if you are especially pointing me to speak something to President Trump, I would say the same thing. Mr. President, this is unallowable. weapon on this earth. Please help us talk it out through treaties rather than intimidating and pushing, because throughout the history, it's not the intimidator that will start the war and do unwise things. It's the intimidated that would study any of their chances. And if they thought there was nothing, they would strike back with everything possible. And should they have their hand in nuclear weapon, please be prepared. It is a beginning of our end.
Hideko, Tamura, Snider, I want to thank you so much for being with us, survivor of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. The memoir recounting that moment is titled One Sunny Day, A Child's Memories of Hiroshima.
Thank you for that, Alan. I mean, I've spent my 45 years working with the Hibakusha, so most of my friends are gone now. There are very few left. If nobody has any further words, then I think we
Hi,
probably
John. This is Moji.
Yeah, Moji.
A few hours ago, I read and I heard some people inside Iran are talking about that we should have had a nuclear bomb. If we had it, we wouldn't have been attacked, and we should go and build it now. And I am from Natanz, as I said. Natanz is my hometown.
Well,
So
well, I would.
what this Hiroshima survivor said is so true, that the intimidated is going to do unwise things.
Well, I mean, your people and you personally, you're a veteran. I mean, what you suffered during the Iraq-Iran war was insufferable, and of course, the United States, basically supported Iraq during that war. I would say, though, that the Ayatollah Khomeini and Khamenei, both of the Ayatollahs, have issued fatwas, and both of them are adamantly opposed to nuclear weapons, and the possession of a nuclear weapon is haram. So, were I an Iranian general, I might be thinking the way you're suggesting, but I mean, you're a Sufi, and the Shia have a very strong tradition of social justice. So I know exactly what you're hearing, because I hear the same thing. But hopefully peace prevails.
This is what I am working on with the peace-seeking Iranian veterans and the project, to plead with the Pope to get involved.
I plan to reach out to you later.
Thank you. Please call me, because my email may not work because they have interfered with my email. I am the kind of Muslim that is not a terrorist. I don't fit the stereotype. So they, I'm a nonviolence activist instead. So they are interfering with my ability to talk about peace.
Well, you know what Gandhi said about Western civilization.
Yeah.
He said he thought it would be a good idea. So,
exactly.
I mean, you have to wonder who the terrorists are when you look at things like Hiroshima, or look at what Belgium did in the Congo, and just what India did, what the British did in India. Just really awful stuff. So.
I actually support the Jewish Voice for Peace, because right now organizations like the Jewish Voice for Peace and similar organizations are protecting Judaism from Zionism. And that's a very important thing. I feel inside Iran, there is a religious, so-called religious government that I try to say, not in my name, you impose hijab on women, for example, in the name of Islam. So the Jewish Voice for Peace says, not in our name. And we need to. So anyhow, I look forward to hearing from you. I hope anybody who can hear me hear my voice of the voiceless. Please help.
Thank you, Moji. And so I just want everyone to know I have to leave. So thank you very much. And some of my old friends that I didn't talk to, I'm going to say good night now. And thank you, Alan. Good night.